Prime Minister Mark Carney is bracing Canadians for his first budget. Speaking last night here in Ottawa, Carney promised unprecedented investments in Canada's economy, but he warns that it will come with a cost.
I will always be straight about the challenges that we face and the choices that we must make. And to be clear, we won't transform our economy easily or in a few months. It will take some sacrifices, and it will take some time. Our government will work relentlessly to cut waste and drive efficiencies. And when we have to make difficult choices, we will be thoughtful, we'll be transparent, and we'll be fair. We will work collaboratively with our colleagues across the aisle to build, protect, and empower Canadians. We won't play games. We won't waste time. And we won't hold back. We will do what it takes.
Carney has met with each opposition leader to discuss his plan for the economy. His government will need support from one party for it to pass. That's not likely to come from the Conservatives.
We got the normal buffet of broken promises and buzzwords. There was lots of talk about catalyzing this and catalyzing that. There was a new promise about doubling exports to non-U.S. markets, all while he refuses to even support the one single thing that would actually export more of our resources to those markets. He's still not stating his support for an oil pipeline to the Pacific.
Well, you know what time it is? It's time to bring in the power panel. Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. Peter MacKay is a former Conservative cabinet minister. Andrew Thompson is a former Saskatchewan NDP cabinet minister. And here with me in studio, Michelle Cadario, who was Deputy Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister Paul Martin. I want to get one question out of the way to everybody, and I'll start with you, Shachi, and we'll sort of work our way through the group. And I mean this honestly, what was the point of that speech last night?
Look, I think there was a point because we spend a lot of time talking about the gap sometimes between the expectations of Canadians, particularly in a post-elbows-up, seemingly new world, versus the actions of the government. And so if there was a point, it was actually more of a political point rather than a policy point, which was to start preparing people in this country for, if you really listen between the lines, like, there are going to be winners and losers in terms of certain sectors. There are going to be very difficult cuts. There are going to be people who come away from this budget and further decisions down the road unhappy. And whereas the first, call it the last 10 years, or the first chapter of this Liberal government seemed to never do anything without politics front and center, I think Carney has been rightly criticized for maybe kind of not watching that flank enough, not doing enough expectation management, not doing enough forward communication around trying to explain what's coming. I think last night was very much an attempt at trying to do that.
And Peter, I get that, I hear that, I think that makes sense. But I feel like that would make more sense if that last night was one of 10 whistle stops across the country where they laid that case. Making a speech in Ottawa 5 nights before the budget doesn't feel like they're really doing the legwork here.
No, it doesn't. And I think Chachi has really hit the nail on the head. This is linguistics. This is an exercise in pre-positioning, much like what we heard previously about spending less and investing more. It's a way to set people up, I guess, as far as their expectations. And who will be those winners and losers? Will it be public servants? Will it be First Nations? Interestingly, he chose to speak to students. Well, certainly young people are the ones who are going to bear the brunt of running another massive deficit, which it certainly looks like it will be. And if that is the case, interest rates, the interest on student debt, I mean, we ran a big deficit in 08-09, and Mr. Carney was there. He would have seen that. And so he may be channeling his inner Stephen Harper in saying, look, I'm an economist. I know about these things. I'm going against my best instincts to get our economy going, and we're going to have to spend a lot of money, but get rid of some of the other big spending initiatives of my predecessor, quite frankly. And this is bitter taste for a lot of Liberals and a lot of people who are sitting behind him thinking, wait a minute, you're kind of unraveling a lot of what we did in the last 10 years. I frankly am glad to see it.
Andrew, if the point of the speech was to lay that groundwork and say, look, tough times are ahead. We're going to cut where we hadn't previously cut. We're going to undo a lot of these programs. I mean, I say maybe that would make more sense if it was part of a whole whistle-stop tour. Is there maybe an argument to say, make the point, give the speech, get to the budget, do the cutting, and then do the explaining afterwards?
I think part of the problem here is he's not set up enough of the sense of what the grand bargain is. There's nothing on the fiscal anchors. There's been nothing about which sectors need to be preserved, where the investments need to go, where the savings need to come from. And I think that what this runs a risk of is that a lot of people will be surprised when the budget all of a sudden is delivered and that there's a huge number of cuts across a wide swath of programs. And I think that'll really be the question as to what the impact is. And this is where I think he runs the risk of losing the narrative to the opposition parties, which, if you're an opposition party supporter, is obviously music to your ears. But it is a danger for a government bringing down a budget if they've not laid a foundation to actually explain why those cuts need to happen, what the guardrails are, and what the expectations are going to be in terms of whether this is long-term suffering or short-term.
Michelle, I'm reminded by the team here that it's 12 days to the budget. I'm overstating things for dramatic impact. But there are 12 days. Is the job now to go out and try to sell this and make the point of where we're going, why we're going there, the impact this is going to have, and to go into the November 4th budget with eyes wide open?
100%. That's the job today. It's the job for the next 12 days, and it's the job for the next 365 days following it. You know, this is going to be the first real benchmark. It's his economic kind of signature as to where he wants to take the country. And, you know, from my past experience with Paul Martin, you're right. We spent a lot of time in the lead up, but it was also different times. It wasn't as social media. Like, news didn't move as fast. And so it's a, you know, you have to put everything into context. But explaining why you are going to do something is so important so that they can understand who you are and what kind of choices that you would make. And, you know, I think that, you know, Andrew's right. There are going to be surprises still there, but I think it's going to come on both sides of the ledger. You know, I think that, you know, he's laid out that there's going to be some difficult choices, which is generally code for that there's going to be some cuts. And he's been pretty clear that he's asking for the spending to come down. He wants to bring in the, you know, this operating side where it's going to be balanced in 3 years. But he's also really laying the groundwork for generational, unheard of spending and building. And I think that he said build 1,000 times more last night than he said catalyze, right? And that was the buzzword kind of coming out of it. And it will be really interesting. He is setting the benchmark. And then today, he's there in Darlington talking about, you know, one of the projects that they're investing $2 billion into. I think we're going to see more of that in the next 10 days and a whole lot more of that in the next 365.
But do you think, Michelle, that Canadians, the Canadians I talked to, came out of that speech hearing the word cuts and focused on that? Are they hearing the balance side of the build side of that? Or is the notion that cuts are coming just going to dominate the political conversation and the economic conversation for the next however many weeks?
Well, I'll be interested to hear what Sashi says, but I think it depends where you are. I think in Ottawa, perhaps, and in and around here, you do hear that as cuts. I think for someone who is unemployed or someone who's feeling that they're in the automobile sector, they're feeling that their job is insecure, they're hearing build and they're hearing investments in the economy, and they're maybe thinking that this means jobs. For people in the steel industry, for people in, you know, some of those other sectors that are under stress, when you're hearing about an intensive kind of effort on defense, on infrastructure, on housing, that might mean opportunities. So I think it kind of always depends on what perspective you're coming at it from.
Well, you put the question to Shachi. What do you think? How are people sort of feeling this? Because she's right that people do want to see the economy grow. But like I talk to people in the steel industry, and they say it's not government programs we need. Steel does well when the economy does well. If we're building stuff, that means the economy is doing well, not that the government's sort of funding stuff. How are Canadians actually seeing the prospect of cuts in this moment?
Oh, I think we actually have to see where those cuts land, who they land with, and I mean, it's an obvious answer, but it also with this, it's going to be pretty difficult to say definitively today what the generalized appetite for cuts is. I mean, I do think that what I can tell you is that when it comes to deficit spending and general government spending, there has been a growing, creeping unease, particularly over the last 5 years, a recognition that post-COVID, yeah, governments needed to spend, they needed to spend a lot and spend quickly, but there is a point where it's like, okay, the argument for this and the reasonableness of this starts to give way to a creeping level of concern as to, hey, wait a minute, are we going to turn off the spigot at any point? So have cuts been rising in terms of, or has government spending been rising in terms of the level of importance Canadians ascribe to it? Yes, it has been. But again, if you're somebody who depends on some of these programs, if you're someone who depends on some of these benefits, it's obviously not going to go over very well with you. So, we'll have to see where and when and how much and to what extent and who is affected before we can really answer that question.
Peter, I always joke that I read budgets backwards. I start at the economic assumptions in the annexes and see what they're building this on. And I'll be really interested to see what they build this on, because the line that jumped out to me from the speech last night was this notion that they're going to double Canadian exports to non-U.S. countries in the next 10 years. Is that, how achievable is that?
That's a great question, Peter. I mean, how achievable is tripling the defense budget in the next 10 years? I mean, these are massive, eye-watering commitments in terms of what we would like to see, and they're aspirational. That's nice. It's hopeful. Yeah. I hearken back to a budget back between 95 and 97, where a massive deficit was run by the Chrétien, maybe Martin Liberals, that resulted in a 32% cut or download to the provinces. Andrew will probably remember this, where social services were shredded. And so I'll tell you, the premiers who've been, for the most part, quite charitable to Prime Minister Carney, they're going to be watching closely. But to come back to your question, how realistic is this? This is a major, major challenge to gore some of these sacred cows, to find a way to trim the public service. That's another very, very fine needle to try to thread, given, what's happening in Ottawa. It's interesting timing that the Auditor General came out with some pretty harsh criticisms of Revenue Canada. So that's also going to be something that the Prime Minister is going to have to try to get his hands around and rationalize. I mean, this may sound bizarre, but maybe he should have offered a pay cut for himself and his cabinet before. That would be a great pre-positioning for this when he's asking young people and others to sacrifice.
Just to correct the record, the 90s were about cutting the deficit and actually balancing the books come hell or high water with Mr. Martin, and from the conservative kind of excess that we had inherited when we actually took over. So just to
but it wasn't in the goodness of Paul Martin's heart that he decided to balance the budget.
No, but it was exactly the bond market made us. Absolutely.
And the bond market isn't making them do anything right now. In fact, the bond market is saying Canada has got all kinds of fiscal capacity. I'm not coming down either side of that, but it's an important distinction in this moment. And Andrew, if we've got to wrap up here this segment just real quick. When you look at there's a couple of things here. One, the need to message this externally, but they've got to find a dance partner in Parliament. When you put everything that we've been talking about here together, who do they reach out to?
Yeah, I think ultimately it'll come down to a question of just how big those cuts are, and that's part of what he was obviously trying to figure out as to what room he had. He doesn't need a lot of votes, but he does need some votes. It's unclear whether the Bloc really wants to go to an election next. Certainly I don't think the NDP is anxious to do so. Is there enough he can do to convince one of those two parties to be able to come on side to save his budget? That's really what the question is going to be. He started to speculate this last week that, and at least his ministers did, that there was a very good possibility the government would fall over this budget. I don't know how real that is, but he was obviously trying to position that for the opposition party, saying he's not afraid to go to an election. He obviously figures he'll come out fine on it, but how those other parties do and whether they're actually prepared to fight one or not, I think is what he was signaling. That of the last week was probably what was the most newsworthy of what's been being said in Ottawa.